Drew has given us the who and why of assembly. Katie covered a little bit of the where of 400 Granby Street, and Christine and Rachel gave us what the design elements were for the project. And I'm going to give you the how of it was integrated into this building. I'm going to use the term preserving here a lot, even though this is not a true preservation project. It was just a poetic way to say we're recovering some of the history of the building. There are instances where materials have been removed and we're trying to reinstate to the original proportions, columns, column surrounds, things like that. So it's really the lens through which design decisions were driven. I'm going to go through each of the floors and only touch on one item for each one. These should cover some of those learning objectives that we had in the beginning. The first floor, we're going to cover resilience, and I wanted to give a little bit of the outline of the building here. You can see that we're on Freemason, Granby, and Monticello. I've highlighted in yellow the phase 1 of the effort, and in green the phase 2 of the effort. And towards the north side of that is a blue zone, and that's really the shared support mechanical and electrical rooms back on the back side. When this project first kicked off and we were trying to understand what we needed to do, considering this was in a low-lying area in downtown Norfolk, we had an elevation certificate drawn and found out that the base flood elevation is about 1.5 feet above our first floor. And the design flood elevation is 4.5 feet above the first floor. We met with the city and went through the processes of what we needed to do, how the historic registration of the building could allow us to deviate from some of that. In the red highlighted areas around the building was where we needed to protect the building the most. So as you can see, it is most of the building. The green, which was the back of the house and where most of the modern additions were done, was already high, so it was even above any problem that could occur. I should talk about a little bit what we were trying to do. We were going to need to, at the perimeter walls, demolish the knee wall there and rebuild it so that it could be structured to withstand a buildup of water 1.5 feet high. The knee wall was going to go to the historic height of the windows shown here, but we weren't going to protect it above that. We weren't going to go to the design flood elevation. That was our allowance because it was a historic building. For the interiors, we were going to have to use a non-paper face gypsum up to that design flood elevation. So if in the worst case scenario, water comes into the building, at least to the design flood elevation, that material is non-porous and won't retain any of those flood waters and all the chemicals and everything that comes with it. We also would have needed to infill the basement and put some trench drains around the entire building. So it was quite substantial, but we were working with the city. Simultaneously, we were working with the city and reviewing the flood insurance program manual pictured here. And we were sort of trying to get an understanding of how FEMA wants guidance given towards historic buildings. And FEMA actually strongly encouraged the designation and renovation of historic buildings. So they want you to designate the building historic and as well kind of recover as much or maintain as much of that history there. And if you all happen to be in downtown Norfolk, or Norfolk anyway, renovating a non-historically designated structure, and you find that the flood-proofing measures are too costly to overcome, you can actually pursue state and federal designation, and that might alleviate some of the measures. For example, would be that 4.5 foot design flood elevation. If the building's historically designated, you can back off of that a little bit. We didn't want to back off completely on this project, so where we had wood on the first floor before, we switched that to terrazzo. We figured if we're taking away some of these flood-proofing measures, we can reinstate materials that are going to allow for minor flood events and cleanup. In 2018, following the work that we were doing, and after the drawings had been sent out to permit, we were able to work with the city to get them to establish that a historic structure does not need any work. So the work that we were proposing, we were able to back off completely. But we didn't want to do that. We still wanted to acknowledge that there is a flood event could happen. The first floor that was non-paper face gypsum, we've now switched that to moisture resistant drywall. We've elevated the bottom of that drywall 6 inches. The baseboard that's running through there is designed so that it can be removed and thrown away if needed. And where we've insulated between walls, we have a short section of that so that it can be pulled and restuffed. And the insulation above that 12-inch height is maintained throughout that. So a major flood event, it won't cover, but minor flood events that allow water in, we have some measure. And the downtown area here is actually protected by a seawall. So we're preparing for it. We're hoping that it doesn't happen, but we have some measures in place to allow it to not be an overwhelming situation should it happen. So in preserving volume for the mezzanine, it's a very simple move. The building was, as you saw in the history of it, a department store. The first floor has a 19-foot floor-to-ceiling measurement. And the blue highlighted areas are basically where a pedestrian can walk by the building. And as part of the historic tax credit project, DHR really wanted us to preserve that volume visibly. So the mezzanine, when we reinstated, is actually pulled back to that northeast corner. In all but one of the instances where you see a wall hitting the outside, those are all glass walls. So even as you're passing through the interior tenant spaces, there is some transparency there, and it's allowing you to perceive that height from both inside and outside. The second floor we dubbed Preserving Transparency, and I might get pinged a little bit on this because I'm using a lot of poetic license here. I'm going to cover the blue zone first, which is the north of the building. And as you can see from the historic image, it was solid mass masonry. But over the years, you can see the Ames and Brownlee building is indicated in the sort of center of the shot. That's the building that we're referencing. In the 90s renovation, some perforations were done in the building, those upper windows. And more recently, on the ground level, they installed a door for a tenant space that was down there. But in the tax credit pursuit, what we were trying to do was make that northwest corner solid again. We counted up all the windows that were there, and I think we were at 7 or 8, and we wanted to add a few. So that was the trade, make that corner solid as it was, how you would experience directly from Granby. And then we are allowed to create new openings, larger openings that spoke to the original volume and proportion that was on the west side, but just on the north side. This allowed for a little bit more program to occur deeper in the building. The highlighted yellow zone for preserving that transparency. Here you can see the image on the left is the historic image, and on the right is a relatively modern image. And the transom windows of the second floor were infilled with metal panel in the 90s. And the third floor, double hung windows were replaced with storefront and also had a false transom that was put in. And that was to conceal some ceilings that they were doing in that portion of the building. The approach was going to be to remove all of those windows and reinstate double hung operable windows. But when they did the demo of the first set of windows, they actually found there was an asbestos mastic back there. So through consultation with Commonwealth Preservation Group, and we went back to DHR for this, we were able to leave these in place, remove the metal infill panels, and provide new glass panels there. And it is quite dramatic to have experienced it with the ceiling on prior to and after the glass infill. And the glass infill wasn't a quick process. One of the subcontractors, Jeffco, they gave us 5 or 6 different glass panels so that we could see the color. We looked at it both from how we observe the outside from the inside, as well as we know there's going to be blinds right behind these windows, and what does the color shift happen there. So it was quite a laborious pursuit, but it was well worth it in the end. Preserving expression. This is actually about mechanical systems, but it's critical to the program. The highlighted yellow portion that's on the perimeter is how we located our heating and cooling effort. We have fan coil units that run around the perimeter, serviced by hot and cold water that runs around the perimeter at the 4th floor and turns down all the way to some locations to the 1st floor. So we're feeding hot and cold water, we're chilling and heating the space through that effort. The blue highlighted zone here is just the core center of the building, and it'll make more sense in this next image. For fresh air delivery, we're able to put a mechanical soffit sort of concentric to the building, still trying to hold it off the exterior edge, but in that blue zone, still letting that user experience be the true volume of the building so that you can see all of the existing concrete encased beams up there, and you get to experience what that is from both outside the building and inside that core blue space. Fresh air is ducted around this, what's been affectionately dubbed the halo. And then all of the access needs we packed back in that top right corner in the corridor near the restrooms. So it's quite a lot of access needs back there. Preserving life, also known as life safety. This is the first time in my 20 years of career that I've ever had to do a reflected ceiling plan for life safety. But this was a historic building. We were trying very specifically to feather through ratings. The building was originally a 2B construction, and we were reclassifying it as 1B. So the highlighted yellow is the primary structural frame, and it had to be 2 hours. The blue zone has a penthouse above it, and also had to be 2 hours. And the green zone is technically classified as roof, even though we have some pedestal pavers out there, and you can walk around that area. And that only had to be 1 hour, including the secondary frame. But in that dark green zone, we had an egress path. Unrelated to the fire rating, we had to get a load rating for that of 100 PSF. So we had to reinforce that zone. And during the tear back of the roof, we found that the roof slab, even though the historic documents suggested a thickness to it, it was much thinner than that. We did some testing, and we actually had to expand some of the reinforcing throughout the pedestal paver area. And how we disguise this, the images on the left are the difference between a 1 hour wrap and a 2 hour wrap. The dashed orange line is the critical element here. We wanted to get as much of the rating inside of that line, but then have a clean finish on the outside so that you couldn't see it. If you look on the bottom right, that detail D4, this is envisioning a sort of a side view of that beam, and the transition between a concrete encased portion of a beam and an exposed. In some instances, they didn't even cast concrete around the beam, they held it off. In other instances, through the life of the building, it was chipped away. So that last layer of drywall, that Type X drywall, is intended to be a complete finish from one column to the other, or one main support girder to the other. And in the same regard, you can see on the right side of the upper two details, we have a lowered coffer. We were really trying to get that as close as possible to that historic finish. This was a discovery through the demolition, and we had to go back to the city and cite an approach. And everything in here, you can see it's talking about a calculated fire resistance. So we were through layers of drywall trying to control all this. We landed on drywall because intumescent paint wouldn't give us a finish, and spray foam insulation wouldn't give us the same finish. Either we still would have to go back with drywall. So that's how we treated the beams and open areas. In preserving views, most often you would see this and you would think, okay, we're going to preserve a view from the building out. This is actually the reverse. I've highlighted some zones here. The light blue here is a low cornice, and it's our best opportunity to see out over the city of Norfolk. We can see down towards the Neon District north of the building. The dark blue zone is a high cornice. It's the same profile cornice that was reinstated in the 90s, but it's overhead. And so the yellow portion is where the pedestal pavers are, and we're trying to drive as much of that effort over to where you can see the most. The dark blue area is a new stair tower that had to be built. And then we have shades of green below those sets of color. And what we were doing here was trying to step the building up further away from that north side of the building so that we can see less of it. It was a requirement that we not disturb the skyline of the city from the pedestrian user. And I'm going to jump around from elevations here, but to give you context, there's the Ames and Brownlee building and the building 2 that occurs behind it. If we jump down onto the ground, this is at Brambleton and Granby. You can see the federal courthouse way back there in the distance. You can see the assembly building, 400 Granby Street. And Katie went out there with an NFL-style telephoto lens and captured this image. During the process, we had to construct a scaffold that we would share back to DHR for approval. And that scaffold was to represent the height of the elevator shaft. So that was the penthouse of the elevator. For context, here you can see 400 Granby. That's where Katie had to stand some 1,000 feet away from the building. And that white thing that you're seeing on top of our building is actually a block away. So it's really kind of a distortion of your perspective from there. And then we overlaid that with a rendering so that we could see how low we were actually on the building. And the efforts that we had done on this part, the stair tower was always a modern element. There was a stair tower there that we were tearing down and reinstating. So really it was the dark brown area in this rendering. And you can't see this until you are actually a block away from the building because of other objects that are in the way.